loading up right now. Um, and you're live right now.
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. One of our special web programs, we're doing them daily now, which is a wonderful thing. Pleased to use the technology of YouTube and of Facebook. We've been moving to add Instagram and Twitter in the future. But here we go. Technology, connecting our community, connecting ideas. I'm pleased today to have a friend and colleague and leader in the community, a young leader in the community, Ebony Adedayo. Ebony, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Ebony runs a project called Recast, or she's part of the team of Recast. Recast is in the city of Minneapolis's division of race and equity. And one of the things the Recast project is doing is developing an oral history of North Minneapolis in particular. It's a wonderful project. Our company, Insight News, has partnered with them to preserve, project, discuss, and market these powerful personal testimonies about what life has been like and what it's like in our community, what expectations and aspirations have been, and how they remain and continue. So we're going to talk about that today, but also the division of race and equity, is like everybody else concerned about the impact of COVID-19. We'll talk about that and in general do a backgrounder on the role and mission of this concept of race and equity as a part of city government. So Ebony, first of all, once again, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's do race and equity 101.
Okay.
I am so happy, number one, that our city of Minneapolis has seen the value of naming something as important and naming it and staffing a mission to discuss with intentionality the question of race and the question of equity. I can tell you that one of the places that it surfaced was when I was interviewing people associated with the Upper Harbor development. And the director of planning and economic development said specifically that the Upper Harbor development is going to be one that will be built on the question of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So the statements alone are significant. The question is, how does it play out in actual real time? But you got to start with saying it, and I think we're off to a great start. So with that background, talk about race and equity in the city of Minneapolis.
Sure. And so for a little background, I've been with the Division of Race and Equity for the last 4 years. I started, not quite 4 years, I started the day after the 2016 presidential election. And so that's how I earmark my time that I've been with the city of Minneapolis. And so the Division of Race and Equity has been around for about 4 years. Actually, I think it was at first the Department of Race and Equity. And then I came in as a program manager for RECAST, which stands for Resiliency in Community After Stress and Trauma. And so since that time, the Division of Race and Equity's work has been very, very vast. The project that I have been most familiar with since being within the division is RECAST. But we also do work around transgender equity as well. We do work inside of the city enterprise to change policies and systems and things of that nature. I know that some of our team have also been working on the Upper Harbor Terminal as well. And there's so many different projects. The work is so vast and so deep and so amazing. And I'm really only privy to what's happening within RECAST because I'm one of the program managers for that body of work.
Well, that's wonderful. Number one, again, I salute you, your division, and the city for the presence of mind, for the intentionality. It's appropriate, proper, and necessary that the city of Minneapolis, talk about race and talk about it without apology, with intentionality of acknowledging the damage experienced by various elements of our population, damage that owes to systemic racism, systemic discrimination, and systemic exclusion. And it's important that now the city or any organization has decided that now's the time to be intentional about changing that narrative. And I think what you're doing reflects the change of narrative. Let's talk about recast. Even before that, uh, let's spend more time on your own personal background.
Sure.
You joined the organization, the city, about 4 years ago. Before
Yes.
that, where were you, and how did you come to the city?
Sure. So prior to being at the city of Minneapolis, I worked for Alliance for Metropolitan Stability, which is a nonprofit organization in the city of Minneapolis working on growth and development issues from an equity angle. I worked there for about 5.5 years as a communications and capacity building manager. And so I did a lot on our social medias, our e-newsletter, and also did some work around this toolkit that we put together called Transformative Equitable Development. That was the last real project that I did prior to coming to the city of Minneapolis. And then prior to the Alliance, I was actually in grad school in seminary, in particular at Bethel Seminary, earning a Master's of Arts in Contextual Studies. And so I've only been, since graduating, I've only been at the city in the Alliance.
Okay. Where are you from? You're from Milwaukee, you told me, I think?
I am from Milwaukee. I moved up here to the Twin Cities a little over 18 years ago to go to undergrad at North Central University. I moved up here because I was part of a denomination called the Assemblies of God, and I really loved the choir that used to minister that would always come down to our summer camps. And so the college that I wanted to go to was here, and I came up here to study missions and ministry, actually. And so I finished up at NCU in 2006 and then went over to Bethel. And so ever since coming up, I've only lived in Minnesota since then.
I often ask my guests, and it's a little invasive, so answer if you will, but you don't have to. I often ask my guests to talk about their lineage, their genealogy.
Okay.
And the spirit of the question is that I believe that we represent our moms and dads and our grandmoms and granddads,
Yeah,
and we represent all of the ancestors.
that's
That
right.
they have never left us, that they are with us all the time.
Absolutely.
So in that spirit, I ask you to talk about those people that poured themselves into the creation of you. What's your sense of being? Where and how have you come to this point? Where
So
from?
I'm gonna try not to cry on this question. I actually just lost my grandmother a few days ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And so like you asking these questions, I'm like, God, what are you doing to me? I'm trying not to cry. My grandmother, I was praying with my pastor yesterday. And one of the things my pastor mentioned as we were praying is that like how, and helped me remember how significant my grandmother was in my life.
Mm-hmm.
She was not my parent, but she was definitely a spiritual parent to me, and helped me tremendously as I became an adult, and was trying to find my way in this world. She was a prayer warrior for me. A lot of my cooking comes from her. A lot of my spirit and tenacity comes from her. And so I feel like I've learned so much from my grandmother. I am her child, in so many different ways, so many beautiful ways. Even though I am not her, like her daughter, I feel like her spiritual daughter because she really nurtured me in things of the spirit and just the direction and the calling, and encouraged me to go to college, encouraged me to join the ministry, encouraged me as I was doing all these different things. Unfortunately, even before she passed, she came down with Alzheimer's. And so that relationship really changed after having my daughter. My daughter is almost 10 years old. And I started to see glimpses of her having Alzheimer's about 9 years ago. She's been in a nursing home for the last 4 years. And the relationship has so shifted because the grandmother that I was used to when I was younger, the one who prayed with me, the one who took me to church, the one who took me to Rocky Rococo's and McDonald's, and who just nurtured me and my sister and other members of our family, she wasn't there anymore. She wasn't there to see my grandchildren and how I was passing on the same things that she taught me to my own family and to my own children. And so like that question is so appropriate today because now I have a new ancestor as of Saturday. and it's been it's been a hard time, but it's also been a beautiful time. And so because of her passing, I've been outside more, gardening more, wanting to get into the soil more, because I feel like there's something happening. There's something happening powerfully with her transition. And so thank you so much for asking that question. You didn't know to ask that question. But like when I think about my lineage, I think about my grandmother and losing this wonderful matriarch who passed at 88. And so I am officially all out of grandparents. And that feels really sad. My grandfather died in 2003, and he was another powerful force in my life. He also took me to church. He also was a nurturer. And so he passed away when I was 22. Not these earphones don't want to stay in. 21, 22. He was also really, really powerful. And I miss them dearly. I miss them both very dearly. Yeah.
And as I said, I'm sure you have discovered or do know that they remain with you. Even today, and even more so. It's a question of how conscious you can make yourself, right? How open you can be to hearing their voice and their spirit and their direction and their protection.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, this is a good conversation. I love one-on-one conversations like this because you never know where they're going to go. And I tell you, I trust the spirit to determine what is important that needs to be said. And I think this conversation is an important one. And it leads to the question of the Oral History Project, because us understanding, preserving, protecting, and projecting our history, our vision is critically important. It's important because in history, our voices have been covered up, dismantled, dismembered, and there has always been an attempt to marginalize our humanity, our personhood, our community, our identity. And those attempts have been aggressive, incessant, horrific, but I can tell you that they have failed and that we continue to survive, thrive, and as Maya said, still we rise.
That's right.
So talk about the History Project, and I'm sure that as you're developing this project for the city, something of your personal journey is guiding you in the analysis and in the appropriation or the curating of these important and powerful stories.
That's right. And I feel like now is doing it in a way that has never been done before, because one of the things that one of my biggest regrets is not being able to I'm sorry for the background noise.
It's okay.
One of my biggest regrets, I think, is not being able to capture my own family's history prior to the time my grandmother developed Alzheimer's. I remember when I first came up to college, we would always talk about being able to sit down together to document our family narratives. And I was never able to do that. And so by the time she developed Alzheimer's 9 years ago, I knew that I wouldn't be able to get those stories about how our family has been resilient, some of the things that we have overcome, the Great Migration and how that impacted our family, how racism and segregation in Indiana and Milwaukee are physically hurt and also spiritually hurt. And so like, I feel that gaping wound in my spirit in a more pronounced way now that she's passed. And I think it does give me much more enthusiasm to make sure that we capture the stories of our elders in our community in North Minneapolis for various reasons, for posterity, but also to understand how we have made it over, how we have survived, what have been the wonderful things that we want to continue to remember for generations, and what are the things that we want to learn from, and how we communicate that to the city as well is just really, really important, because the city has played a role in what has happened in place. All governments do, but the city has definitely played a role when you think about the history of North Minneapolis and other communities within the city and the Twin Cities. Our governments and the decisions around redlining, the decisions around police violence, the decisions around land use, so many different things have impacted how communities have formed and have survived and have thrived and have suffered throughout all of these years. And so being able to capture those narratives so that they're written, so that they're not hidden, so that we can elevate the voices that you said have been tried, that people have tried to bury, that people have tried to silence for generations, to be able to elevate those voices and to have those documented in this time is really beautiful. And I think the other beautiful thing about this project is just even in capturing the stories, one of the tools that we worked with 4,000 More Creative to capture the oral narratives of 90 elders in the community. One of the things that this contractor did is partnered with youth to actually get those stories. And so I think it's so beautiful that in the process of capturing and doing these projects, that the youth that may have been disconnected from some of these narratives have the opportunity to sit down and interview elders in these really intimate ways. And so I think that there's just beautiful coming together that happens as a result of that.
It's like what you were missing with your grandma. Now
Yes.
you're in the process to connect young people who have this natural curiosity to elders who, if we don't do this, we probably will lose a lot of more information, or at least not be able to fully develop and utilize that information that these elders contain and bring to the table. So Recast, what's the name mean? Why is the project called Recast? And give people, our viewers and listeners, an idea of the 3 or 4 mission points of the Recast Oral History Project.
So Recast, again, stands for Resiliency in Community After Stress and Trauma. It is a federally funded initiative from the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level within the department called SAMHSA, which stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. This program exists as a means to address community stress and trauma that arises as a result of structural violence. Within the city of Minneapolis and most of the cities around the country that have this grant, the impetus of the work was a officer-involved shooting in Minneapolis. That shooting was Jamar Clark. Most of the cities that have this grant have it because of something like this. Milwaukee also is one of the cities that have this grant because of a shooting that took place on Sherman in Milwaukee. You don't know where the landmark is, but because of a shooting that took place there of a young man in the summer of August of 2016. And so most of the cities that have this have it because of that. Flint is the only city that does not have this grant because of an officer-involved shooting, but has it because of the violence of the water crisis. And so within the city of Minneapolis, the way that we are contextualizing Recast are really about advancing 3 main goals. One of the things I should say before I get to the goals is that within the city, we are really unique because we are housed in the city coordinator's office. Most of the other cities that have this grant, the grant is housed within the health department. Because we're housed within the coordinators, one of the beautiful things is that we get to work on policy development and change as we are also talking about meeting the mental and behavioral health needs of folks. And so within the city, we are also doing this two-strand approach thing where we are providing services to community members and we're also providing services to city staff. We're trying to change city policy as we're trying to make sure that there are services that are meeting the needs of folks on the ground. So that both things are happening simultaneously. So with that, the 3 main goals are really about making sure that city and staff together are better, that we're better, we're stronger, we're more resilient together, that together we can shift policies and change systems. So the 3 main goals being building greater trust and understanding between city and community. Making sure, and the second goal is making sure that community and staff have the capacity to be well and have mechanisms to further on in their health and wellness. The third one is creating opportunities for shared decision making. And so within that, the Oral History Project really aligns with the first goal about building greater trust and understanding. And so prior to the North Minneapolis Oral History Project, we did a project around capturing different narratives and community in South Minneapolis, where there's this beautiful, if you, next time, after this pandemic is over and we're able to go out in public and see each other, and you can come down to City Hall, there is this beautiful mural on the third floor, right across from City Chambers. And that mural was constructed, I think, within the first year and a half of the work that we're doing around this. That one was, really reflects the narratives of immigrants in the community in South Minneapolis, and just their stories of how they've gotten here and what they've had to navigate, including the systems that they've had to navigate in order to be well and to be more resilient. And so the Northside Oral History Project is a parallel project that is about capturing community stories around the Penn and Plymouth area in North Minneapolis to create that shared trust and understanding. Because I think one of the things that happens is that, staff don't understand community doesn't understand staff. Being able to come together and share those narratives about who we are, how we've gotten here, who we want to be, where we want to go, is really, really powerful in relationship building and building trust.
Let me react just images that pop in my mind as you're speaking, thoughts, reflections, memories. Number one, I just remembered that when I was 20 years old, and I'm 72 now, I was in the Navy stationed in Jacksonville, Florida. And when we would leave our base, Mayport is the naval base just outside of Jacksonville, most of the guys on this ship would take a bus downtown for Liberty, they called it, right? And what I remember of that experience is that when we, black sailors and white sailors in uniform got downtown, the white sailors went one way and we went another way. So our worlds were divided right then and there, even though we were comrades and brothers at sea or in the trenches if we'd been in the Army. And so there's this division that's always been there. And the thought of it came up simply because you said that as often as not, even the people we work with in government or in corporations don't know our story. Yeah. And don't know our community, don't know our lives. And that thought led me to another memory. The memory was one that when me and colleagues, a brother named Nhi Nguyen in particular, a Vietnamese guy who owned the Asian American Press, he and I called on the Minnesota Health Department to start doing business with ethnic media. And particularly around the time there was this emerging scare for HIV/AIDS. And around that time, that's why it reminds me of today a little bit, there was massive disinformation, people coming up with all kinds of crazy stuff, basically marginalizing people of color in general, Black people in particular, blaming Black people for HIV/AIDS. So a willingness to cast blame, but not to invest in education, information, affirmation. And that, in my view, was a failure in public policy. So we met once with leaders at the health department and said, you all need to be advertising in Black newspapers, radio stations, and Asian, Latino, et cetera. And their response to me about Black newspapers, twofold. One, Black people don't read. So that's part of the mindset at that time, that Black people simply did not read. And so why would we put an ad in the newspaper? The second response is, if they do read, they read the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press, and what else is out there that Black people could read? And so I asked them, have you ever heard of Jet Magazine? And Jet Magazine, was on every table in every Black household in the country. We grew up with Jet Magazine, Ebony Magazine. Yes. They were totally, totally oblivious to the fact that we had a world in which our culture was projected, adored, admonished, that's right. Nurtured, elevated, and they were simply clueless. And the problem is they wanted to be clueless because their intent was that we learn how to make ourselves into many white people or to imitations of white people. And that meant disavowing, rejecting anything that is Black, African, that is not of their making and not reflective of their sense of glory, vaingloriousness, I call it. So anyway,
Yeah.
these thoughts come up. That's why it's important to me, Ebony Adedayo, that you are undertaking and executing in a beautiful way this ability to connect our people to our history. And history is not an abstract from the way distant past. It's people around us right now. History is us as we are creating it. And that's what the Recast Project does in part. Capture vibrant, living
Yes.
testimonies, experiences, and appreciates them, memorializes them, and suggests the power of these lives in building a community and a future in which we see ourselves winning and as equity partners in the creation of community and of city
Yes.
life. What do you think?
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's the purpose of the project. The purpose of the project is prosperity. The purpose of the project is systems change. Like, how do we make sure that tomorrow, we're learning from the lessons that happened yesterday? I mean, from the things that happened yesterday, the things that happened, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, the oft quoted saying is like, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's cliche and also is true at the same time. It's like, how do we learn from the lessons of the past, of even the lessons of the present, the things that continue to present themselves to us? How do we learn and move forward as a people, as a community, as a city? One of the things you talked about was the division when you would go out with your friends, and that does happen within our cities. But the reality is that, and I think this current pandemic shows us, is that we are all affected by this current pandemic in different ways, but we're all affected by it. And so division doesn't really serve us in the long run. I think it just furthers the isolation and furthers the hatred and furthers the amount of disagreement and the disparities that happens in our community because of divisions. And so I think coming together and having this understanding of just this trust in what has happened to our communities as Black folk, but then what has happened to the city as a whole, is just really, really important to make sure that we can actually move forward with equity in mind. And that's been really, really key in our division, even right now, as we think about COVID-19, is like, how do we move forward in creating a new future for our people after this crisis is over with equity in mind? How do we actually lead with equity? How are the policy decisions, the practices, the programs? How do we make sure that equity is front and central, racial equity is front and central to how we do the work now and into the future? Because one of the things that we are seeing right now is that even though the pandemic is affecting all of us, it is affecting Black folks in a particular, different, devastating way, which shows you that even though we're all affected, we are more adversely affected. And so, how do we make sure that moving forward that we stop this? And I don't think it's an easy solution, because one of the things that the late Derek Bell says is that this country was built on the premise of racism. Like, it's permanent. It has this enduring effect. And so we're not gonna get rid of it overnight. But I do think that there's hope and there's promise in continuing to push forward policies and procedures that are actually designed with equity, that centralize race in how we do things, so that we have a hope of having something different in the future.
Let me give you a preview of a book that's coming out. Make a note of this. There's a Minneapolis author. His name is Tom Weber, and he's got a book called Minneapolis, an Urban Biography, soon to be released by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. I was asked to write a sentence or two about it. I read it and I was fascinated by it. Pleased to do that. So when it does come out, you see a sentence or two on the jacket from me, but I've already begun writing an actual review. I just want to share maybe a couple of paragraphs of that. This is these are actually pencil notes, as you can see that. So I don't know if it's showing up there on
it's not, but I believe you.
On the camera, yeah. But anyway, so I'm writing this as we speak, but it's germane to our conversation. Minneapolis, an Urban Biography by Tom Weber is a refreshing look at where we are today as a consequence of public policy created to serve the interest of the few. the men who cobbled and hoarded power to secure and protect their wealth and power. This book is uniquely refreshing because it forms an expanding genre of history texts that illuminate, or better, shine with the light emitted by competing, though marginally real ties. Well, I can't even read my notes here, but I go on to say that this book talks about the what's not talked about, and that's what you're affording now, voices that are seldom heard. This book goes into understanding what people winked and nodded about and went about doing their business of power and control at the expense of the values and the professed a commitment to democracy, equality, and brotherhood. So those are great ideals. The American idea is a phenomenal idea, but the reality has always been distant from that. I think the challenge of the day is to continue the fight to bring substance to the notion of democracy, freedom, justice, liberty for all. And that's been the essential, I think, role of African people, Black people in our culture since we fought our way through and beyond slavery, through Jim Crow. And as we continue to fight right now, today, pressing the idea that yes, Black lives matter. We do that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
so,
right.
You mentioned that right now we've got the challenge of COVID, of the pandemic. How does this affect the work of the project that you're working on, the Oral Histories Project, and how do you see generally as a mental health issue our community and your projects being impacted by things like social distancing, the need to do things differently?
Yep. So one of the things I didn't mention is that, so this project, the Oral History Project, was really conceived in two phases. So phase one was about capturing the stories of the elders, which happened in the spring of 2018 and 2019. As I mentioned, 4,000 More Creative was really key in helping us get those stories. And within the last year of data collection, they partnered with Masjid Anur, Liberty Community Church, UROC, NERC, and Oak Park to get these stories from community elders and from other folks in the community. And so that was really pivotal in helping us collect these 90 stories. The second phase of the project was about making sure that artists have an opportunity, artists such as yourselves have an opportunity to take these 90 stories and create some more permanence to them through either curriculum development, through a mural, through a newspaper article, things of that nature, so that the stories aren't just in that raw data form, but that they can exist in other forms as well that are more accessible. Because let me tell you, 90 stories is a lot of hours, and people aren't going to sit down and listen and read through that. Like when we print out the transcripts, we have almost 700 pages. Like that's a lot of data. And so being able to distill down these stories into digestible ways through our projects, make it more accessible to the public, make it more accessible to city staff and to community members. And so in this second phase, we selected, and actually not we, the community selected, we had a community voting process where over 300 people participated in selecting the 4 artists who are now working on this project. We selected Insight News, which, you know, since you belong to Insight News, we selected Bully Creative, and they were going to be putting together some docuseries about the 90 stories. We also selected artist Melody Strong, who is an art teacher over at Franklin Middle School, who's putting together a beautiful mural. And we also selected Charles Caldwell as well, who was putting together a mural for these stories. And so we selected these artists, including yourself, back in September with the intention of wrapping up this phase today. Actually, we were thinking by the end of April, we would be done. And we have been doing, like our artists have been doing engagement, they have been doing pop-ups. I participated in sessions with Mr. Caldwell and with Melody, Ms. Strong at the school. And just the engagement sessions have been really, really wonderful. And as of March, what was it, 16th, because of the social distancing, there hasn't been able to be a whole lot of progress, because one of the premises about these projects was making sure that we are not just doing the art in bubbles, I mean, isolated from one another, but that we would be engaging city staff, we would be engaging community members, we'd be engaging students and electeds. And so in many ways, some of these projects are having to recalibrate and think about how to move forward. Some of them are at a standstill. And because we don't know how long we will be here, no one knows, but only God knows how long we will be in this situation. We don't know what the project will look like in the future. And so one of the things that we are encouraging the artists that we did select is to think about how the scope of work may need to change. How does the final product need to change to make sure that these stories do have permanence? One of the things, and if I can just be candid with you, I feel like this is a spiritual battle, like honestly, because this project started when I first started as staff back in 2016, and we keep trying to wrap it up, and we keep hitting hurdles. And I don't think that that's coincidence. I do think it is a spiritual attack, honestly, because when we think about what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to do in terms of elevating stories of a community that have been ignored, like why would the enemy want that? Why would, and just speaking from a spiritual plane, like why, when we think about our history and our struggles as people in this country for over 400 years, and the struggles that we have had to make our voices known, our history known. And now we have this project that has full support from the city to move forward and do this. And the roadblocks that we continue to hit that have been human made, and have also been, I guess, like, what is this, biologically made? Like, it's laughable to me. And it's like, there's gotta be something, another dynamic at play for why this project has persisted so long and why we can't wrap it up in the way that we want to. And so I think in this time of social distancing, I wanna, even though that's not necessarily my role at the city, because that's my role as a person, as a human being, is to lean into what is happening in the spirit, so that we can find resolution and so that we can move forward in the best way possible. But I think the other dynamic is that, because this is happening, we also know that because COVID is happening, we also know that there's a huge mental and behavioral health need in our community, in all of our communities around, not just the city of Minneapolis, but globally. But because my work is within the city of Minneapolis, I will speak specifically to that. There's a huge, mental and behavioral health need in terms of like the isolation. We are social creatures by design. We are supposed to be in relationship and community with one another. We're supposed to be hugging on one another in our times of grief and in our times of even joy. We're supposed to be in each other's presence. And the very fact that we can't is traumatizing. The very fact that we do have to be in isolation and not go out and not see each other and not touch one another. Like that human touch is so essential to our well-being. The fact that we can't right now is harmful. It's harming all of us. And so one of the things that the Division of Race and Equity has done is we have put together a mental health relief fund for mental and behavioral health providers and professionals. Can you hold on for a second?
Sure.
Please go ask Daddy's downstairs.
That's the beauty of working at home right now, because you still got to be with the people you love. That's a good
all of the people, all of them, 6 and 9 years old, and so beautiful, so independent, and has so many needs at the same time.
Sure.
What I was saying is that we have put together, the division has put together this emergency relief fund to help out mental and behavioral health providers to provide care to folks who are experiencing stress and trauma, not just because of the crisis, but because we know that our communities were already experiencing harm prior to COVID. COVID has just elevated some things in different ways that have already existed. But this fund is supposed to be for providers to provide telehealth services to community folks, to professionals, to we have a huge community that are being provided that need service. And so that's what the services are about. That's what the fund is about.
You know, the question is a question of trauma, and that's part of the mission, and kind of comes around full circle because you said the trauma of Jamar Clark and police shootings generally was the starting point for the recast project nationwide, right? Most of the cities that are part of it have experienced the trauma that individuals and that the community as a consequence experienced around a police shooting. And now, as opposed to a specific event like an individual being shot, we are all experiencing trauma in a fresh way, in a way that none of us can escape. Everybody is impacted by it. So it personalizes what we may have been able to put off as them over there.
Yeah.
We could say, oh yeah, that happened over on Plymouth Avenue. I live somewhere else. It doesn't really bother me. Not my problem. That's not true anymore. The problem of COVID-19, everybody's problem everywhere. And but it still is an important issue for you and me, you as a person that knew, was it Sherman Avenue in Milwaukee?
Sherman, yes.
Sherman, and me as a person that lives on Plymouth Avenue or just off of North Minneapolis, we still both are impacted and our neighborhoods are impacted more. The numbers indicate greater risk, greater vulnerability because of the historic health inequities, health disparities. And as you said, the COVID challenge simply shines a bigger light on historic inequities, imbalances, but it also compels and gives us an opportunity to renew our vigor and our voice and our fight in a way that as we address COVID-19, we also address obesity, we address tobacco use and abuse, alcohol use and abuse in our community, we address violence in our community, we address education disparities, outcomes, we address wealth disparities. So I think that at the bottom line here, we are in an era where the precision, the precise and broad impact of COVID-19 allows us a window to look at all the things that make us vulnerable and to decide that we have the power to address each and everything with an outcome intended of improving the quality of life for ourselves, our neighbors, our families, and all of humanity. That's what I think.
That's right.
Listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate what you do, your work. I appreciate your voice, your vision. And let me ask you to close the program out with closing thoughts, invitations to our listeners and viewers to follow the work that you're doing at Recast and to support this work as well.
Sure. And so a couple of closing things. We selected 29 providers who are offering a variety of services, including therapy. Right now, I can't think of all of the things that are happening right now. So if you follow us on Facebook, Recast Minneapolis, we're on Facebook. Also, our website, Division of Race and Equity. If you put in Division of Race and Equity Minneapolis, most likely our page would be the first, or at least the first one when I put it in my browser, because I do it all the time. But our page will pop up, and on our page around, I think it's trauma and healing training or Recast, there is a link for all of the providers who are offering services right now. You can also sign up for our newsletter. You can also email me at ebony.adedayo@minneapolismn.gov, and I can forward anyone who's interested that list of all of the providers who are offering care, because it's a lot. And so we aren't able to do all of the things that we want to do, but we know that in this moment, we do have the capacity to be a benefit to community in this really small way. So I would encourage you to sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Facebook, find us online to get access to those tools. Also, during this season, one of the things that my colleague is doing, is sending out bi-weekly. So we have a bi-weekly newsletter that goes out anyway, but every other week, she is sending out a newsletter specifically about COVID related resources. And so that's another good reason to get signed up to our email list, because it's not just about what the city is doing, but what is happening across the scale that people can plug into if they need relief, if they need resources, not just around mental and behavioral health, but if they just need resources, period. I think one of the resources in there today was about like gap funding for people who may be experiencing housing instability.
Mhm.
And so, and we know that that has a mental and behavioral health impact, but we also know that we need to meet people's felt needs as well, not just the behavior, not just the mental and the spiritual needs. Like both things need to happen at the same time. So those are that's what I have to offer closing out. That please follow us online, get plugged into what the Division of Race and Equity is doing, because we're doing a lot, not just around COVID. Like I talked about my work being around recast.
Mhm.
And that's just a small sliver of the work, the wonderful work that the division is doing. And so sign up to find out about all the other amazing things. Like one of the things that our division did last year was pass our first racial equity bill within the city of Minneapolis. And I had amazing colleagues who worked on that. So you definitely want to just follow and get plugged in so you can keep abreast of what's going on beyond what I am doing.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. It goes so fast. I want to thank you so much, Ebony Adedayo, with the
Thank you.
Recast Project in Minneapolis Division of Race and Equity. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your testimony, your story, and thank you for bringing all of the ancestors with you to this
Yes.
wonderful conversation. And keep up the good work. Let's keep this conversation going. I can tell people you can go to Insight's webpage and you'll start seeing the stories that that have been created on Insight News. And then fairly shortly, you'll be able to see on newsstands images that you can take a picture of. And there's a QR code that you can snap a picture of. It'll take you to the collection of stories. So that's what we're doing to support this work. Innovative engagement, important work. We're pleased to be a part of it. And you'll see these stories in the paper as we roll them out. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. Thank you for being here. Tomorrow,
Thank you for having me.
Tomorrow, we're going to have our doctors panel again. We'll be on at noon tomorrow. We're calling the medical practitioner session Serving the Underserved, and have physicians from Twin Cities and actually a physician from Puerto Rico as well joining the conversation to talk about things that you should know from experts that you can trust. We're also doing a regular public policy session every Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Join in. We want to have community organizations, community leaders, elected officials, legacy institution leaders in a conversation about public policy. On Tuesdays, of course, we have at 1 o'clock the regular broadcast version of Conversations with Al McFarlane, which we're now streaming to Facebook and to YouTube as well. That happens at KFAI 90.3 FM and KFAI.org, Tuesdays at 1 o'clock. Wednesdays, new programming, we're developing that. But Thursdays, today, for example, talking about community, about connectivity, about art, culture, health, about things that we can do to be together, to be our best selves. Well, if you like this kind of programming, we invite you to like it and to share it. Send us a note, call us up with ideas, suggestions. If you want to be in a conversation, we want to have a conversation with you. Reach out to me at al@insightnews.com. I'll reach out, I'll respond to you, and we'll see how we can bring our voices together. Until tomorrow, we'll see you. I'm Al McFarlane. Bye-bye. So, great program, good conversation.
It was good. It went by really fast.
It goes quickly. It goes quickly, and
it does.
So good.
Yes.
And thank you so much. And we'll keep archiving and keep this work going. So we're still live on YouTube right now. So Kelvin will be signing us out momentarily. So this